There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a small town after something goes wrong. Not the silence of peace, not the silence of an ordinary Tuesday evening when the rain comes down slow and the diners fill up and the traffic lights blink through their cycles without anyone paying attention. This is a different kind of silence, the kind that comes after, the kind that fills the space where noise used to be. Cleburne, Texas had that silence for a long time before anyone decided to name it. The town prided itself on the things that small Texas towns have always prided themselves on: Friday night football, church attendance, neighbor knowing neighbor. The kind of community where people waved from their trucks even when they didn't know whose truck they were waving at. It was a town that believed in order. It believed in authority. It believed with the particular fervor of a place that had never seriously examined its own assumptions, that the men in uniform were the good ones. And the complaints about those men when they surfaced, and they did surface 11 times in 6 years, from one officer alone, were treated as the product of difficult people and misunderstood situations, rather than evidence of anything that needed to change. What the town did not know on the evening of that rainy Tuesday in October was that the man in the wheelchair outside the Lone Star Diner had a sealed military commendation locked in a box under his bed. It did not know that the commendation described in the precise and restrained language of Army citation documents an act of combat rescue so extraordinary that 2 different generals had attempted to present the medal in person and had been quietly declined. Both times. It did not know that the name of the soldier rescued in that citation was a name that would mean something to exactly the wrong person in exactly the wrong moment. It did not know any of this, because the man in the wheelchair had never told anyone. He had come to Cleburne 3 years earlier looking for quiet, and he had found it mostly. He had rented a small house on the eastern edge of town where the lots were wider and the neighbors fewer and nobody asked questions that required long answers. He had set up a garage workshop with second-hand tools and a parts catalog he had memorized through repetition. He had made himself useful in the specific, invisible way that some people do when they have decided that visibility costs more than it is worth. He had been wrong about one thing. He had believed that if he stayed quiet enough, small enough, unremarkable enough, the world would leave him alone. He was wrong. It found him anyway. Marcus Reed was 52 years old, and he had the posture of a man who had once been required to maintain it under conditions that made posture seem like the least relevant thing in the world, and had maintained it anyway, even in the wheelchair. Even after a decade of chronic pain and 2 shattered vertebrae and the particular exhaustion that comes not from physical damage alone, but from carrying physical damage in silence. He sat straight. His shoulders were broad beneath a worn olive-green jacket. His hands resting on the armrests of the motorized chair were large and steady. The hands of someone who had spent years doing precise work in imprecise conditions. He was a quiet man, not shy. Quiet. There is a difference, and anyone who spent more than 10 minutes with Marcus Reed understood it instinctively. He listened with his full attention, which is rarer than it sounds. He answered questions with the minimum number of words the question required. He did not fill silences with noise, which unsettled some people and reassured others. He had grown up in Fort Worth, the youngest of 4 children, the son of a school custodian and a licensed practical nurse who had worked double shifts for 17 years to make sure none of her children went to bed without certainty about the next morning. Marcus had enlisted at 19, not because he had no other options, but because he wanted something that would demand everything he had. The Army Ranger program had obliged him thoroughly. 30 years later, the demanding was done, and what it had left behind lived in his body every day. The IED that ended his operational career had detonated on a hillside in the Korengal Valley on a night in 2007, a night he did not describe to anyone. a night he had not described to anyone in the 17 years since. The medical report was specific and detailed. Marcus's memory of that night was specific and detailed in a different way. Not in the sequence of events which he remembered with clinical precision, but in the texture of certain moments. The weight of another man's body across his shoulders, the smell of burning, the sound of his own breath coming in and going out while he focused on the next step and the step after that and kept moving until he couldn't. He had woken up in a military hospital in Germany. Both legs were gone below the knee. Several vertebrae were fractured. His left shoulder had been partially reconstructed. He had been in surgery for 11 hours. The Army had wanted to give him a Silver Star. He had said no, twice. He had come home to the country that thanked veterans at airports and sporting events and put them in commercials. And he had found that the thanking and the actual care were organized at a significant distance from each other. He had navigated 3 years of VA bureaucracy for the wheelchair alone. He had repaired his own chair twice with parts he ordered online because the VA's equipment division ran on a timeline that bore no relationship to the timeline of chronic need. He had learned through this process that he was better at fixing wheelchairs than the people whose job it was to fix wheelchairs. That other veterans in the same situation were willing to pay him for the skill, and that he was not willing to take their money, and that they were going to leave it on his workbench anyway. This was how the workshop had started. This was the shape of his life in Cleburne. He kept a metal box under his bed. Inside it, 3 citations, 1 photograph, and a sealed American flag case. He had never shown the box to anyone. One of the citations bore the name E. Mercer. He had not looked at that citation in 4 years. He did not need to look at it. He remembered what it said. Daniel Mercer had been a Cleburne police officer for 10 years. And he had spent the majority of those 10 years operating under the assumption that the institution protecting him was an accurate reflection of his value, rather than a mechanism designed to protect itself. He was 38. He had the kind of broad, square-jawed face that photographed well in department publicity materials and inspired confidence in people who decide what they think of law enforcement by deciding what they think of law enforcement's photographs. He had been used in 3 different department recruitment campaigns over the years. He kept copies of the photographs without being asked. The complaints against him, 11 of them, spread across 6 years, filed by people whose names he had largely forgotten, had never produced a formal finding of misconduct. This was not because the complaints were unfounded. It was because a sergeant named Ray Dolan, who had been on the force for 22 years, had quietly ensured that each complaint traveled through a review process designed to arrive at a predetermined conclusion. Dolan had taken Mercer under his guidance in Mercer's 3rd year on the force. He recognized in the younger officer a particular temperament: aggressive, status-conscious, easily threatened by anything that challenged his authority. He taught Mercer the informal rules of what the department's culture would and would not tolerate. He taught him where the camera blind spots were. He taught him how to write a report that established the subject as the source of the confrontation. He had taught him without ever stating it plainly that certain people in certain neighborhoods required a different calibration of authority than others. Mercer had learned all of this with the enthusiasm of someone who had been waiting to be given permission. He had a younger brother named Ethan who was 34 years old and had lost both legs in Afghanistan 8 years earlier. Daniel talked about his brother's service frequently, with the particular pride of someone who has attached their own identity to another person's sacrifice. But underneath the pride was something he had never examined closely: resentment. He blamed the Army for what had happened to Ethan. He blamed whatever combination of poor planning and institutional indifference had put his little brother in a vehicle on a road that should have been cleared and wasn't. Over the years, he had translated that blame into a general suspicion of people he associated irrationally and without examination with the disruption of order. People who didn't look like they belonged where they were. Ethan was coming home to Cleburne in 72 hours, permanently, after years in VIA rehabilitation facilities in San Antonio and Houston, and one long winter in Albuquerque, that had finally gotten his phantom pain under enough control to make daily life manageable. Daniel had organized a welcome home gathering at the family house. He had called the local paper. He had made it, as he made most things involving Ethan, partly about Ethan and partly about himself. Ethan, for his part, had spent the last 7 years looking for a name attached to a photograph he carried in a small envelope in his wheelchair bag, creased from handling, slightly blurred on one edge where it had been wet once and dried imperfectly. The Army's records office had told him the rescue report was partially sealed pending commendation review. They had given him a unit designation and a first name. They had told him 3 years running that the commendation was in process. He had not told Daniel what he was looking for. He wasn't sure Daniel would understand. The rain came in from the southwest that Tuesday evening, the way October rain does in Texas. Not dramatic, but persistent. The kind that soaks through without announcing itself. By 6 in the evening, the Lone Star Diner on Commerce Street was filling up with its usual crowd. Retired couples who ate dinner early. A few contractors still in their work clothes. A table of women from one of the church auxiliaries. The counter had its regulars. The coffee was strong, the pie was reliable, and the waitress named Carol had been pouring both for 11 years with the unhurried competence of someone who had decided long ago that her job was to take care of people, and had not reconsidered that decision since. Marcus arrived at the Lone Star when he needed a reason to leave the workshop. The garage was warm and familiar and necessary. But there were evenings when the walls came close and the silence inside his own head got loud in the particular way that needed to be replaced by someone else's noise. He didn't eat at the diner often. He ordered coffee, sometimes pie. He sat at the accessible table near the entrance, the one with the extra space on one side, and he watched the room and listened to the ambient sound of ordinary life continuing. And after an hour or so, he felt recalibrated enough to go home. That evening, the chair's battery indicator was showing yellow when he reached the diner's covered entrance. He needed to charge it before navigating the return trip. He positioned himself near the entrance out of the primary foot traffic path and waited for the rain to ease. The flag case was on his lap, as it always was when he left the house, a habit he had never fully examined and had given up trying to change. He was not blocking the door. There was clear passage on either side of him. A man inside, sitting by the window, watched Marcus for about 3 minutes, then called the manager over. He described a suspicious individual blocking the entrance. He used the phrase, homeless looking. The manager, a cautious man named Gerald, made the call to the non-emergency line. Mercer was parked 3 blocks away between patrols when the call came through. He took it personally. He arrived in 4 minutes. He sat in the cruiser for perhaps 15 seconds, looking through the rain-streaked windshield at Marcus Reed near the diner entrance. He did not call out a greeting. He did not assess the situation from a distance. He got out of the car. He approached with his shoulders squared and his jaw set, his hand resting at his belt in the loose, deliberate way that Dolan had taught him. His boots were loud on the wet pavement. He did not say hello. He did not ask what was happening. He told Marcus to move. Marcus looked at him with the steady, expressionless attention of someone who had been in situations where reading a person correctly in the first 10 seconds determined what happened in the next hour. He did not move immediately. He indicated with a small gesture toward the battery indicator that his charge was low. He pointed at the rain. Mercer looked at the battery indicator and at the rain, and decided that neither of these things was his concern. He told Marcus that the diner's entrance was not a parking spot. He told him that sitting there with a military case on his lap was a method he had seen before. He used the phrase, sympathy prop. He told Marcus that real families were going to be arriving for dinner, and that the establishment did not need what he was bringing to its doorstep. Marcus said nothing. Inside, Carol had moved to the front window. James Okafor, a 58-year-old retired Marine who ate at the Lone Star every Tuesday, had put down his fork. A woman named Patricia Ware, sitting with her 9-year-old daughter Lily, had quietly told Lily to sit still. And Lily, who was watching everything with the wide and careful eyes of a child who understands that something important is happening, had already taken her mother's phone from the table. Mercer's voice had been climbing. The words were getting shorter, harsher, clipped into the shape of commands. He told Marcus he was creating a public nuisance. He questioned with the particular contempt of someone who has decided an outcome before examining the evidence whether Marcus had actually served, or whether the jacket was bought at a thrift store. Marcus was still. It was the stillness that broke something in Mercer. He had learned from years of practice that stillness meant one of two things: fear or defiance. He had decided in the first 15 seconds that this was defiance. He had never considered the possibility that it was something else entirely. The absolute bone-deep composure of a man who had been in environments where panic killed people, and who had trained himself so thoroughly out of panic that it no longer registered as an option. Mercer stepped forward and kicked the footrest of the wheelchair. It was not a full kick. It was the kind of kick that says, "I am establishing dominance," a distinction that would prove entirely meaningless in the footage already being captured on 3 separate phones. The force of it spun the front of the chair slightly and sent the flag case off Marcus's lap and onto the wet pavement. The sound it made was quiet, but in the context of what had just happened, it felt very loud. The diner went silent. Marcus looked at the flag case on the ground. He looked at Mercer. He did not speak. He lowered himself as far as he could from the chair, which was not far enough to reach the ground. And Mercer watched him struggle without moving to help, then told him to take it and go. Marcus retrieved what he could. He put the case back on his lap. He turned the chair toward the street and went out into the rain, moving slowly because the battery was still yellow and the curb cut was slick. And he disappeared into the wet dark of Commerce Street without a word. Carol stood at the front window watching him go. She thought about going after him. She didn't. What she did was walk to the spot where he had been. And there, under the decorative planter near the entrance, she found the flag case. Marcus had not noticed it in the difficulty of the moment. He had taken his canvas bag and not realized the case had slid further than he thought. Carol picked it up. She put it behind the counter. She would think about that moment, about whether she should have done more, said more, moved faster for a long time afterward. By 9 o'clock that evening, Patricia Ware had posted the clearest of the 3 videos to her Facebook page with a 2-sentence caption. This happened tonight outside the Lone Star Diner in Cleburne, Texas. The man in the wheelchair is a veteran. By 11, the video had been shared 4,000 times. By 6 the following morning, the combined view count across all 3 platforms had reached 800,000. Lily's footage was the one being shared most widely. Shot from slightly above and to the side, it captured both Mercer's face and badge number, the full arc of the kick, and the flag case falling. It was the one where you could see in the half-second before the case hit the ground, Marcus's hand reaching instinctively forward, and not making it in time. Veterans organizations moved with the kind of coordinated speed that social media had made possible. 3 groups with a combined membership of 230,000 members shared the footage within hours. 2 sitting U.S. senators were tagged in over 40,000 posts by 8 in the morning. A veterans advocacy organization in Dallas called for an immediate independent review before most of Cleburne had finished its first cup of coffee. At 7 that morning, the Cleburne Police Department issued its official statement. It described the incident as a routine welfare check resolved without incident. It praised Officer Mercer's decade of service. It stated that the department took all concerns seriously and that an internal review was already underway. 900,000 people read that statement over the following 12 hours. The predominant response was not reassurance. It was rage. Sergeant Dolan called Mercer at 6:15 in the morning and told him two things. Say nothing, and the union was already on it. Mercer said he understood. He had been in this position before in a smaller way, and it had resolved. He was operating on the reasonable assumption constructed from 11 prior resolutions that this would also resolve. He was wrong. In a way, he would not understand for several days. Lieutenant Patricia Vane of the Cleburne PD's Internal Affairs Division had closed 4 of Daniel Mercer's 11 prior complaints. She had done this not through corruption in the transactional sense. No money had changed hands. No explicit agreement had been made, but through the quieter corruption of institutional loyalty. The kind that looks like procedure from the outside and functions as protection from the inside. She was assigned to the case by 8 in the morning. By noon, she had reviewed the 3 videos, read the body camera records, and spoken briefly with Mercer by phone. By 3 in the afternoon, she had drafted a preliminary finding. It classified the incident as use of lawful dispersal authority in a non-criminal welfare context. It noted that no arrest had been made, that no injury had been documented, and that the subject had departed voluntarily. The finding did not address the footage. It did not address the 11 prior complaints. It did not address the fact that Marcus Reed had not been engaged in any unlawful activity at any point during the encounter. It was exactly the kind of document that the institution had learned to produce. The union's statement came at 2 in the afternoon. 4 paragraphs. The first praised Mercer's service. The second warned against prejudging officers based on incomplete footage. The third called social media a weapon against law enforcement professionals. The fourth announced full support for Mercer and the readiness to challenge any adverse finding. The statement had been coordinated with Dolan. It had been signed before the investigation was complete. These were facts that would become relevant later, in a federal court filing, in language considerably less diplomatic than anything the union had produced. Councilman Frank Rudd appeared on a local television segment at 5 in the afternoon. He described Marcus as an unidentified individual whose situation and background remain unclear. He called for calm. He called for patience. He called for trust in the department's review process. He had received $14,000 in police union campaign contributions over 4 years. This was public record, accessible through the county's campaign finance database. No one had looked at it yet. What was visible to anyone paying attention was the mechanism. A complaint was filed. Internal Affairs reviewed it. The union issued a statement. A friendly council member appeared on television. The complaint was closed. The officer continued 11 times. This was how 11 times had worked. This was the 12th time. And the 12th time was different in a way that none of the participants had accounted for. It was on video. It was being watched by a very large number of people who were very angry. And one of the witnesses at the diner had already made a call. Ethan Mercer's transport from the VA facility in San Antonio had been arranged before the incident at the diner. He arrived at the Cleburne bus terminal on Thursday afternoon with the particular self-possession of someone who has learned to navigate a world designed for a different body and has stopped being bothered by the learning curve. He was 34 years old. He looked both older and younger than that. Older in the eyes, younger in the face, which had the unguarded quality of someone who had decided somewhere along the line that guardedness was not worth the maintenance cost. He had no cell service during transit. He had seen nothing. He saw it in Daniel's kitchen at 6 in the evening, on Daniel's laptop. At Daniel's kitchen table while Daniel stood by the counter with his arms crossed in the posture of someone expecting to be believed. Ethan watched all 3 videos without speaking. He watched the Lily Ware footage twice. He watched it a 3rd time and paused it at the moment the flag case fell. He asked Daniel one question, not an angry question, a quiet one. He asked what the man had done. Daniel said what he had been saying publicly. The man had been loitering, blocking the entrance, hadn't responded to lawful instructions. He used the word liability. He used the phrase standard dispersal procedure. He did not make eye contact while saying either. Ethan asked about the flag case. Daniel said he didn't know what was in it. He said it wasn't relevant. Ethan asked where the case was now. Daniel didn't know. He hadn't thought to ask. Ethan went to the Lone Star Diner at 8 the following morning. Carol was there for the opening shift. When Ethan came in and introduced himself and explained what he was looking for, Carol looked at him for a long moment with the careful assessment of someone deciding whether to trust. Then she went behind the counter and produced the flag case from under the register where she had kept it safe. She handed it to him. Ethan opened it at the counter, and Carol watched his face change. The Silver Star citation was on top, folded in thirds. Below it, a combat rescue commendation on Army letterhead stamped and signed, describing in flat official language an action that its language was structurally incapable of capturing adequately. Below that, a military ID photograph, worn at the edges, a younger face, 20 years younger in full Ranger uniform, with the precise and direct gaze of someone who had not yet learned what it would cost him to be himself in this world. Ethan had been carrying a copy of this photograph for 7 years. He sat at the counter for a long time. Carol poured him coffee without being asked and left him alone with it, which was exactly the right thing to do. Ethan spent the next 48 hours doing 4 things. He contacted the Department of the Army's Records Office and confirmed what he had suspected from the moment he opened the flag case. Marcus Darnell Reed, 3rd Ranger Battalion, Korengal Valley Rescue Operation. Classified commendation pending voluntary acceptance, 2007 to present. The commendation had been in suspended status for 17 years because Marcus had declined the ceremony twice, and the Army in the manner of institutions that contain multitudes had neither withdrawn the commendation nor completed it without his consent. He found James Okafor through the local VFW chapter directory, which Carol had mentioned. Okafor met him at a coffee shop on Friday morning and spent 2 hours telling Ethan everything he knew about Marcus, and everything he had witnessed at the diner, which was more than the videos captured because Okafor had been close enough to hear the specific words Mercer used when the cameras were at their maximum zoom and the audio was partially obscured by rain. Okafor connected Ethan with Sandra Kwan. Kwan was 46, precise, unhurried. She had taken a civil rights case involving a veteran in a neighboring county 3 years earlier and won it in federal court in 14 months. She had the specific energy of someone who had long since stopped being surprised by the behavior of institutions and had redirected all the energy she might have spent on surprise into the work of dismantling them through available legal mechanisms. Kwan met with Ethan on Friday afternoon. He told her everything. She listened without interrupting. At the end of the conversation, she asked 3 questions. Did Marcus know his rights under federal civil rights law? Did Marcus have documentation of the incident beyond the public videos? And was Marcus willing to be represented? Ethan said he would ask. He went to Marcus's house that evening. He had not planned what he would say. He knocked on the door of the small house on the eastern edge of Cleburne and waited. Marcus opened the door and looked at him for a moment, and said nothing. Ethan said his last name, just his last name. Marcus looked at him for another moment, then stepped back from the doorway. They sat in the kitchen for 2 hours. Marcus made coffee. They did not discuss the diner. They did not discuss Afghanistan. They discussed in the methodical way of 2 people who have both learned the value of precision under pressure, what the legal situation was, what the options were, and what Marcus was and was not willing to have happen. Marcus said he would not use his military record as a press tool. He said this once, without elaboration. And it was clear that he had said it once because once was all it needed. He said he would meet with Sandra Kwan. He met with her the following morning. She documented his condition in writing at the start of the meeting. Marcus's military record was not to be disclosed to the press or used as a public relations instrument. Marcus reviewed the language and said it was acceptable. Then Quan told him what was in the complaint she was preparing. She had documented every element of the encounter at the diner from the 3 videos: Okafor's first-hand account, Carol's account, and Patricia Ware's account. She had pulled Mercer's 11 prior complaints from public records and cross-referenced their closure timelines with Internal Affairs review records. She had found a pattern in those closures that was difficult to explain as coincidence. She had obtained Dolan's union intervention records through a public records request that had been pending for 6 months and had arrived with the particular timing of bureaucratic processes 2 days earlier. She had also found the financial relationship between Councilman Rudd and the police union. She filed the federal civil rights complaint the following Monday morning. Named defendants: Officer Daniel Mercer, Sergeant Raymond Dolan, Lieutenant Patricia Vane, the City of Cleburne. The filing ran to 47 pages, Exhibits A through P. The Texas Rangers announced an independent investigation the same afternoon. Cleburne PD's ability to conduct its own review was formally suspended. National media picked up the federal filing on Tuesday, not just the video now, but the structure behind the video. 11 prior complaints, 4 dismissals by the same Internal Affairs lieutenant, union intervention on every single one, a city councilman with campaign contribution documentation now accessible through 3 separate investigative reports published simultaneously by outlets that had been working the story for a week. It was no longer the story of one officer and one veteran on a rainy Tuesday evening. It had become the story of how a particular kind of institution maintains itself. How complaints are not investigated so much as managed. How the word procedural can be used to make the indefensible look like the considered. How a community can believe it is safe and fairly administered because it has been given no mechanism for learning otherwise. 3 of the 11 prior complainants gave interviews within the same 48-hour window. They had not coordinated with each other. They had simply been waiting in the way that people wait when they have been told their experience was not real, and have spent years knowing that it was for a moment when saying it out loud might count for something. Their stories had the structural similarity that tends to emerge when people have experienced the same thing from the same source: an encounter without legal basis, escalating verbal aggression, physical contact, a report that described them as the source of the escalation, a complaint filed, a dismissal letter received, a phone call from the union that wasn't exactly a threat and wasn't exactly not one. Mercer was placed on administrative leave. Dolan secured paid leave status through the union before the department's public affairs office had drafted a response to the Texas Rangers' inquiry. The chief, a man who had spent 30 years as a careful and conflict-averse administrator, agreed to the arrangement with the particular resignation of someone who has run out of better options. The reporters were outside the precinct by Wednesday morning. Local businesses that had displayed support signs took them down without comment. The diner manager, Gerald, gave a brief interview in which he said he wished he had handled the initial complaint call differently. He used the word regret twice. Marcus said nothing publicly. He was not hiding. He was in his garage with the 4 wheelchairs that needed attention and the 2 veterans who had been waiting on parts since before the diner incident. Okafor visited daily and kept him informed. Marcus listened and asked occasional clarifying questions and returned to whatever he was working on. The absence of his voice was becoming paradoxically the loudest thing about the story. Every news segment noted it. Every thread about the case eventually arrived at the same question. Where is he? Why isn't he talking? And the answer that he had simply decided not to, because the talking was not why he had come to Cleburne, generated more interest and more investment in the story than any interview could have. Dolan made his last play on the Friday before the public hearing. He had a contact in the county records office who had surfaced 9 years earlier a brief detention report involving Marcus Reed. Marcus had been held for 3 hours on a disorderly conduct call in Fort Worth in 2015, a case that arose from a confrontation in a VA parking lot, where Marcus had verbally challenged an administrator who had denied his claim for the third consecutive time. The charges had been dropped the same day. The record had been expunged. It was legally as though it had never happened. Dolan's contact passed the original report through a back channel to a blogger named Mitchell Crane, who operated a site that described itself as an independent accountability journalism platform and functioned in practice as a place where the local power structure leaked things it wanted public but did not want its name attached to. Crane published it Friday afternoon, Marcus Reed's Hidden Criminal Past. By Friday evening, 2 social media accounts later traced to the police union's communications coordinator had amplified the post to a combined audience of 80,000 people. By Friday night, Sandra Kwan had filed an emergency motion in federal court, citing witness intimidation and obstruction of justice. She attached documentation of the union coordinator's social media activity and included a sworn statement from Marcus's Fort Worth attorney confirming the record's expunged status. The federal judge issued a preservation order Saturday morning and a formal warning to the Cleburne Police Department by name. The post came down Saturday afternoon. Mitchell Crane issued a brief statement saying he had acted on incomplete information and regretted any harm caused. The word regret was doing a great deal of work in Cleburne that week. The Army's Public Affairs Office released a statement Saturday evening. It confirmed that Marcus Reed had served with the 3rd Ranger Battalion and that a commendation remained pending in his service record. It did not disclose the commendation's contents. It did not need to. The confirmation alone told people everything they needed to understand about what Mercer had kicked into the rain. The governor's office called the mayor on Sunday. The content of the call was not disclosed. But the mayor's statement the following morning announced full cooperation with all federal and state investigations and noted that personnel changes were under review. Daniel Mercer watched the body cam footage from his own unit on Wednesday evening, alone in his apartment. Not his body cam, which had not been activated, but the patrol unit camera from a cruiser parked across the street from the diner at the time of the incident, its forward-facing dash camera running on its standard continuous loop. The footage had been entered into the evidence record by the Texas Rangers. It showed the scene from a wider angle than any of the phone videos. It showed the approach, the conversation, the kick, the flag case falling. It showed the timeline more clearly than anything else. From Mercer's arrival to Marcus's departure, 6 minutes and 40 seconds, Mercer watched it once. Then he read the federal complaint for the first time. All 47 pages. His attorney had been summarizing it, but he had not read it directly. He read the list of 11 complaints. He read the documented pattern of dismissals. He read the affidavit from Patricia Ware and the affidavit from James Okafor, and the affidavit from Carol, who had written 3 pages describing with precise and unhurried clarity exactly what she had seen and heard. He read a line near the end of Kwan's complaint in the section addressing Marcus's background that referenced a sealed military commendation in Marcus's service record. The line did not name the rescued soldier. It simply noted that the commendation existed, that it had been twice declined, and that its existence was relevant to establishing Marcus's character and the particular quality of the harm done. Mercer sat with that line for a long time. He thought about Ethan. He thought about the photograph Ethan had been carrying, the one Ethan had mentioned once and then not mentioned again. The one Mercer had assumed was someone Ethan had served with and had not asked about because asking Ethan about Afghanistan was a doorway Mercer had never felt prepared to walk through. He drove to Marcus's street that night. He sat in his car across the road from the small house with the light on in the garage. He could see through the partially open door 2 other men inside. He could hear faintly the sound of people talking, not the sound of people in crisis, the sound of people doing something together. He sat there for 40 minutes, then drove home. He did not sleep. He lay on his back in the dark and ran through the inventory of 11 complaints like a man reviewing a ledger he had been told was clean and is now seeing for the first time as it actually is. Each incident had its story. Each story had a version that Dolan had helped him articulate. He had told those versions so many times that they had replaced whatever had actually happened. And confronting the original events now felt like trying to remember a language he had never quite spoken fluently. He thought about Marcus retrieving the flag case from the wet ground without a word. He thought about that stillness which he had read as defiance, and which, replaying it now at 2 a.m, with the distortion of his own justifications removed, looked like something else entirely. Something that had a specific weight, a specific history, a specific cost that Mercer had been completely unequipped in that moment to recognize. He did not call Dolan. He did not call the Union. He lay in the dark and was alone with what he had done, which is the place that all of it eventually arrives, when the mechanisms run out. The Cleburne City Council Public Safety hearing convened at 7 p.m. on Thursday. The chambers were not designed for the crowd that filled them. Every seat was taken by 6:45. People stood along the back wall. 14 veterans in uniform occupied the 2 rows behind the public testimony table, not as a coordinated demonstration, but as individuals who had each independently decided to wear what they had earned. 7 camera operators were arranged along the side wall. All 9 council members were present, including Councilman Rudd, who had arrived late and taken his seat without making eye contact with anyone. Sandra Kwan presented first. She did not perform. She presented. She had 47 pages of documentation and 22 minutes on the clock, and she used both precisely. The 3 videos played in sequence on the display screen. The timeline of the 11 complaints and their dismissal dates was projected beside them. The financial relationship between the police union and Councilman Rudd's campaign was displayed as a simple table with dates and amounts. The documented origin of the expunged record leak was shown through the social media coordinator's account activity, which the federal preservation order had secured before it could be deleted. She did not editorialize. She did not need to. The documentation editorialized itself. The prior complainants testified in sequence. The first was a man of 58 named Robert Calvin, who described a 2019 traffic stop that ended with him on the ground and a report that described him as the physical aggressor. He was a retired postal worker who had lived in Cleburne for 22 years. He used the word afraid once, and once was enough. The second was a woman named Diana Reyes, who described a parking lot confrontation that ended with her car being searched without consent. She had received a union letter at her home 10 days after filing her complaint. She had kept the letter. She had brought it. The third was a young man named Kevin Marsh, who described a stop in language so similar to what Marcus had experienced at the diner that 3 people in the gallery audibly inhaled. Then Marcus came to the table. He wheeled in from the side entrance. He positioned himself at the testimony table and adjusted the microphone with a small practiced motion. The chamber, which had been murmuring and shifting, went still. He spoke for 7 minutes. He described the battery indicator. He described the rain. He described the flag case on his lap. He described what Mercer had said in sequence using Mercer's exact words, where he remembered them precisely. He described the kick. He described the case on the ground. He described the return through the rain. He did not raise his voice. He did not editorialize. He did not mention the Army. He did not mention Afghanistan. He described 6 minutes and 40 seconds in a parking lot in Texas and what they had contained. When he finished, there was a silence that lasted long enough to be notable. Councilman Rudd broke it. He asked Marcus why, if he was truly a decorated veteran with documentation, he had not produced that documentation at the diner or afterward. He framed it as a matter of procedure and clarity. It landed as what it was. Ethan Mercer had been sitting in the gallery for the full 2 hours of the hearing. He was wearing his VA-issued wheelchair and a button-down shirt, and the expression of someone who has prepared for something difficult and has arrived at the moment of it. He had not told Daniel he was attending. He had not told Quan he intended to speak. What he had done before coming to the chambers was retrieve the flag case from Marcus's house and the Army commendation documents from Quan's file. Quan had released them to him under the condition that he understood what releasing them publicly would mean. Ethan understood. When Rudd finished his question, Ethan wheeled himself from the gallery to the front of the chamber without asking permission. He positioned himself at the testimony table beside Marcus and placed the flag case and the folded commendation documents on the table between them. He gave his name. He gave his service record. 3rd Ranger Battalion, 2 tours, Afghanistan, 2006 to 2007. He said his legs had been lost in the Korengal Valley in November 2007 in an ambush that left him trapped inside a burning vehicle. He said that the man who had carried him out of that vehicle through active gunfire, who had administered morphine from his own supply while bleeding from his own wounds, who had kept him conscious and alive during the extraction by repeating every 30 seconds the words, "You are going home," that is an order, was the same man who had just spent 7 minutes describing without complaint and without adornment what Daniel Mercer had done to him outside the Lone Star Diner on a Tuesday evening in October. He said that Marcus had declined the Silver Star ceremony twice, because Marcus had decided in the way that people who have genuinely done something at great cost sometimes decide that the ceremony was not the point and never had been. He said that Marcus had come to Cleburne to fix wheelchairs and drink coffee at the diner and be left alone, and that what Cleburne had offered him instead was a man in a uniform telling him that his flag case was a prop and his disability was a performance and his presence on the sidewalk was an imposition. He said he had spent 7 years looking for Marcus to say thank you. He said he was saying it now. The chamber did not erupt. It went silent. In the way that rooms go silent when something true has entered them that is too large for noise to address. Cameras recorded the silence. The silence lasted long enough that it would become in the following days the most shared moment of the entire story. Not the confrontation footage, not Quan's presentation, but this. A man in a wheelchair on a stage in Cleburne, Texas, saying the thing that needed saying in a room that had gone completely still to receive it. Daniel Mercer was at home, watching the hearings live stream on his laptop, alone, since 7 in the evening. He had watched Quan's presentation. He had watched the 3 prior complainants. He had watched Marcus. He was watching when Ethan wheeled to the front of the room. He heard his brother say his name. He heard his brother say Marcus's name. He heard his brother describe the Korengal Valley in the particular, precise, non-dramatized way that Ethan always described the things that had actually happened to him. The way that makes true things land harder than any performance could. He understood what he had done, not in the abstract way he had been processing it for 10 days, not through the mechanisms of justification and institutional protection, in the direct and irreversible way. He understood what the flag case was. He understood what the stillness had been. He understood that when he had told his brother that the man was a drunk cripple causing problems, he had said it about the person Ethan had spent 7 years trying to find. He closed the laptop. He sat in the dark. The council voted at 9:40 in the evening on the termination of Officer Daniel Mercer's employment effective immediately. 8 in favor, 1 opposed. On the suspension without pay of Sergeant Raymond Dolan pending criminal referral to the State Attorney General's office. 9 in favor, 0 opposed. on the removal of Lieutenant Patricia Vane from the Internal Affairs Division and referral of her case to the State Attorney General's office. 9 in favor, 0 opposed. Councilman Rudd recused himself from the remaining votes after Council Chair Lisa Eng entered the financial contribution table into the formal record. He did not seek re-election when his term ended. He did not issue a statement explaining why. The federal civil rights case proceeded. The city of Cleburne's legal team recommended settlement within 6 weeks of the hearing. The settlement amount was not publicly disclosed, but the consent decree attached to it was public record. It mandated body cameras for all patrol officers with footage released within 72 hours of any use of force incident. A civilian oversight board with subpoena authority. A prohibition on any quota-based enforcement metric. Mandatory annual bias and de-escalation training. And an independent audit of all use of force complaints from the preceding 6 years. The audit identified 14 additional cases that warranted review. 3 resulted in findings against officers who had previously received clean records. 2 of those officers resigned before their termination hearings. The institution did not transform. It was corrected. There is a difference. And the difference matters, because transformation implies a change of character. Correction implies an enforcement of accountability, and accountability, unlike character, does not require anyone to feel differently about anything. It only requires that the consequences exist. Marcus went back to the workshop. Not after a pause, not after a ceremony, not after a period of reflection publicly documented. He went back the morning after the hearing because there were 4 wheelchairs in various states of repair and 2 veterans who had been waiting on parts since before any of this had begun. The parts had arrived Wednesday afternoon and were sitting in a box on the workbench, and the work needed doing. The local VFW chapter established the Reed Repair Program without consulting Marcus about the name. He found out when Okafor told him 3 weeks after the hearing that the chapter had voted unanimously to fund the workshop's parts and operating costs going forward, and that a small plaque with his name on it had been mounted beside the garage door while he was inside. He went outside and looked at the plaque for a long moment. He went back inside and picked up a wrench. Ethan came every Saturday morning. He had moved into a house 2 miles from Marcus's on the eastern side of Cleburne, and had within his first month home developed a talent for motor diagnostics that Marcus acknowledged with the particular minimalism of an instructor who considers an accurate result its own sufficient praise. They did not talk about Afghanistan. They did not discuss the hearing or the lawsuit or the settlement or the coverage that continued for several weeks in smaller and smaller increments until it subsided, as all coverage does, into the larger noise of the world. They repaired wheelchairs. They drank coffee. On Saturdays, when the weather was good, they ate lunch on Marcus's front steps and watched the neighborhood go about its business. Ethan asked questions about motor mechanisms, and Marcus answered them. Sometimes they sat in companionable silence, which is a specific kind of ease that only exists between people who have been through something together and have arrived separately at the same understanding of what it meant. The Lone Star Diner installed an automatic door for wheelchair access in November. The manager, Gerald, personally oversaw the installation and stood outside on the opening morning watching the door operate for 15 minutes before going back inside. He did not issue a press release about it. He had been told by the installer that automatic doors averaged about 100 uses a day at locations with similar traffic. He thought about that and did not say anything about it to anyone. The door opened and closed and opened and closed all day for everyone who came through it, which was the point. The town of Cleburne was not redeemed by what happened. It was not inspired to a new relationship with itself by a story that reflected poorly on its instincts and its institutions. What it was corrected by a legal process, a federal consent decree, a series of votes at a council hearing that ran until nearly 10 at night, and the slow, unremarkable work of accountability operating through the mechanisms that exist for it. Body cameras went up. Footage was released on the timeline the decree specified. The Civilian Oversight Board met for the first time in January and spent 3 hours reviewing a complaint filed by a resident in the Western Precinct. They issued a finding. The finding was documented. The documentation was public. None of this was dramatic. None of it made a story that anyone would share. It was simply the next thing, and the thing after that, and the thing after that. Which is what justice looks like when it is not performing itself but actually doing the work. Marcus Reed had not come to Cleburne to change it. He had not asked to be the reason it was changed. He had asked to be left alone, which was a reasonable request and one the town had failed to honor. And the failure had cost the town more than it had cost him in the accounting that matters, which is the one where what you did to someone else becomes the permanent record of who you were when you thought no one was watching. Someone was watching. Someone is always watching. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe to our channel.